Book 13. The chieftains had taken their seats. A crowd gathered round in a ring, and they were the audience that Ajax, lord of the sevenfold shield, stood up to address. Unable, as usual, to govern his temper, he grimly surveyed the ships along the shore of Sagaeum. Then, with a gesture towards them, he said, "In the name of Jupiter, here are the two of us putting our case in front of those vessels, and I, great Ajax, am asked to compare myself with Ulysses. He beat a hasty retreat when Hector attacked with his torches, while I stood my ground and saved the fleet by routing the foe. It's safer, it seems, to fight with lies and ingenious talk than engage in arms like a man. But speaking isn't my chief strength, as action is not my opponent's. My power in the fury of battle is matched by his skill in debate. No need, I think, to recite my actions to you, my Argive friends, as you saw them yourselves. Ulysses may tell you his own, the actions for which he cannot produce one witness, the actions which only the night is aware of. The prize that I seek is a great one, I freely admit, but my rival detracts from its value. It isn't an honor for Ajax to win whatever Ulysses has hoped to achieve, no matter how splendid. Ulysses has won a prize as it is. When he loses this match, he'll be sure of the glory of having competed with Ajax, with me. What's more, if anyone chose to question the valor of Ajax, my noble birth would give me the edge. My father was Telamon, hero who captured the walls of Troy when the valiant Hercules led the attack, and joined the Argonauts sailing to Colchis. His father was Acis, now a judge of the spirits in Hades, where shifty Sisyphus strains against the weight of his rock. King Jupiter frankly acknowledges Aeacus's place as a son of his own, so Ajax is third in line of descent from Jove. However, my ancestry shouldn't be used as a point in my favor, unless I share it with great Achilles. He was my cousin, and I am demanding my cousin's arms. As Sisyphus's scion, Ulysses, and equal in fraud and deceit, are you trying to graft the name of an alien line on Aeacus's family tree? Must the arms be denied to me because I entered the war before my opponent and wasn't enrolled by a sneaking informer? Should he be accorded the prior claim when he joined up last, when he tried to escape from military service by feigning madness, until another more crafty fellow, although he was doing himself no good, Polyphemus, exposed his cowardly fiction, and dragged him along to the expedition he'd sought to avoid? Is he to take the best arms because he refused to take up any? Am I to be slighted, deprived of the prize which belonged to my cousin, since I was first to throw myself into danger? I wish, indeed, that Ulysses' madness had either been real or believed to be real. I wish that this instigator of crime had never accompanied us to the fortress of Troy. If so, Philoctetes would not be marooned on Lemnos to our discredit, hidden, they say, in tree-covered caves, disturbing the rocks with his groans, and raining curses on vile Ulysses, curses richly deserved, which must be fulfilled if the gods exist. And now that hero, who took the same oath of alliance as we did, one of our captains, to whom the dying Hercules handed his bow, is broken by sickness, starving, clothed and fed by the birds which he kills with arrows that ought to be killing the Trojans. But still, Philoctetes lives, since he did not go with Ulysses to Troy, while poor Polyphemus would rather have been abandoned. He was the man who'd exposed my opponent's pretended madness and had to pay. Ulysses remembered it all too well. He falsely accused Polyphemus of treason against the Greeks. What evidence did he produce? It was gold he had buried beforehand. This shows how Ulysses has sapped our strength by exile or murder. That's how he fights, and that is the kind of fear he inspires. Ulysses' eloquence may surpass even trusty Nestor's, but that will never induce me to think his desertion of Nestor was other than shamefully wrong. The tired old man was in trouble, because his horse had been wounded. He cried to Ulysses for help, but his comrade betrayed him. Ulysses' friend Diomedes can vouch that I'm not making this up, as he shouted Ulysses' name again and again and castigated his cowardly flight. But the gods survey the actions of mortals with eyes of justice. Ulysses was later in need of the help which he'd failed to supply. In abandoning Nestor, he'd shown how he himself should be treated. He yelled for his friends. I, Ajax, arrived and could see him quaking, pale and trembling with fear at the thought of the death confronting him. Setting my massive shield in front of his prostrate body, I saved his life. Small credit in saving so feeble a sluggard. Listen to me. If you want to persist in this contest, let's go once more to the spot. You can bring the enemy back with your wound and your typical fear. Hide under my shield and compete with me there. But then, what happened? The man whose wounds had prevented him standing after I'd rescued him ran, and there wasn't a wound on his body. Hector arrived and entered the fray with the gods on his side. Wherever he charged on the field, he struck astonishing terror not only in cowards like you, Ulysses, but brave men too. As he reveled in all the havoc he'd wreaked and the blood he had shed, I threw an enormous stone from a distance and laid him flat. Earlier on, when he challenged a Greek to engage in a duel, I took him on by myself. When the lots were cast, you Greeks all prayed that I should be chosen to fight, and your prayers were answered. How did the duel turn out? I wasn't defeated by Hector. Later, the Trojans attacked our ships with fire and sword and Jupiter's help. Where now was the brilliant speaker Ulysses? I, with my manly body, protected the 1,000 ships, your hopes of return. So give me those arms for my own protection. But allow me to tell you the truth of the matter. Those arms are owed to a greater tribute than I am. Their glory and mine are united. Ajax isn't claiming the arms claim Ajax. Ulysses may set his own deeds against mine, the deaths of King Rhesus and Dolon the craven spy, the capture of Priam's son, Helenus, the theft of Pallas Athena's statue. None of those actions took place in the daytime. What's more, Diomedes was always beside him. If you were disposed to award these arms for such trivial exploits, you ought to divide them and give Diomedes the larger share. But why should Ulysses receive them? He always operates under cover and carries no arms when he steals on the foe with his ruses. The glint which shines from Achilles' golden helmet by moonlight will give him away and show him up as he lurks in ambush. The Ithacan's head will never be able to carry the weight of that great plumed helmet. The spear of Pelian ash will be far too massive and heavy for feeble arms such as his to throw, and the shield, embossed with its picture displaying the whole wide world, can hardly look well on that soft left hand with its talent for stealing. How can you claim a reward which will sap your strength? You are shameless. Even supposing the Greeks were foolish enough to agree, you won't give the Trojans a reason to fear you, but only to rob you. Retreat. The single art in which you excel, you cowardly weakling, will grind to a halt if you're trailing that great heavy object behind you in flight. Moreover, the shield that you have so rarely employed in battle is perfectly sound, while mine, which is riddled with countless holes from the spears it has stopped, is in need of a replacement. In short, is argument needed? Much better to judge us in action. Cast the brave hero's arms, Greeks, into the ranks of the foe, then call for those arms to be fetched, and let the recoverer keep them. The highborn Ajax ended his speech, and his final words drew a buzz from the crowd, which continued until the noble Ulysses rose to his feet. For a while he fixed his gaze on the ground, then he looked straight up at the chiefs who were eagerly waiting in silence, and opened his speech in words as engaging as they were persuasive. Princes of Greece, if only my prayers along with your own had prevailed, the victor in this grand contest would not be in doubt. Achilles would still have his arms, and we should still have Achilles. So, since fate has so unkindly denied him to all of you and to me, He spoke with a gesture of wiping the tears away from his eyes. What better person to follow the great Achilles than I, who enabled the great Achilles to follow the Greek cause? You shouldn't let Ajax's dullness of intellect count in his favor, or hold my quickness against myself. It has always been used in your service, my lords. Don't grudge me my eloquence, such as it is. It has often pleaded for you in the past, and now it is bound to plead for its master. We cannot ignore the gifts that we have. Ancestry, forebears, titles we haven't achieved for ourselves are scarcely points we can urge. But Ajax has argued that he is Jupiter's great-grandson. My extraction also goes back to Jupiter. I, like Ajax, am third in the line of descent. I am the son of Laertes, son of Arcesius, fathered by Jove, and my pedigree doesn't include a convict in exile. I also enjoy high birth through my mother, as she is descended from Mercury. Traces of God can be found in both of my parents. However, my claim to the arms of Achilles is not dependent either on being more nobly born on my mother's side or on having a father untouched by the guilt of killing his brother. Judge this case on our personal merits, provided that Ajax receives no credit for being Achilles' cousin, as Peleus was Telamon's brother. No, let the judgment of arms be a tribute to valor, or else, if the next of kin must be first to inherit, and that is the test, then Achilles' weapons should surely be given to Peleus his father or Pyrrhus his son. No room there for Ajax. Arrange for those weapons to be dispatched to Phthia or Scyros, and Teucer, no less than Ajax, has rights as a cousin. Is he pursuing a claim? And supposing he did, would he be successful? In short, this contest depends on actions purely and simply, and I have performed more deeds than I have the skill to encompass in words. But still, let me tell them in order, as each occurred. The sea goddess Thetis knew that her son was fated to die if he went to Troy, so she dressed Achilles up as a girl, and everyone, Ajax included, was taken in by the female disguise. But I, to excite his masculine interest, inserted some arms amongst our feminine wares. He still was dressed in the clothes of a girl when I caught him holding a spear and shield, and said to him, "Son of a goddess, Pergamum, doomed to perish, is waiting for you. Why shrink from destroying magnificent Troy?" Then I gripped his shoulder and sent him forth to a warrior's glory. Therefore Achilles' deeds are my own. It was I whose spear disabled our enemy Telephus, I who later applied that spear to the conquered king, when he begged to be healed of his wounds. The fall of Thebae is my achievement. Attribute to me the capture of Lesbos, Scyros, Apollo's cities of Tenedos, Chrysae, and Scylla. My hand it was that battered Lyrnessus' walls and laid them in ruins. Indeed, it was I who provided the man who was able to kill fierce Hector, to mention no others. I floored the notorious Hector. So then, in return for the weapons through which I discovered Achilles, I claim these weapons before us. I gave him arms while he lived, and demand arms back from him dead. When one man's grievance came to involve the whole of Greece, and the 1,000 ships were assembled at Aulis to back Menelaus, they waited for many months, but the winds were always against them, or failed entirely to blow. Then a harsh announcement required Agamemnon to slaughter his innocent daughter to cruel Diana. This he refused to do. He resented the god's decree, and the king still harbored a father's love. But my persuasions induced him to harden his heart for the sake of the common good. It was I have to confess, and I hope that royal Agamemnon will pardon me for it, who argued that difficult case in front of a partial judge. In the end, he was swayed by the people's interest, his brother's wrongs, and his role as commander to balance his honor against the blood of his daughter. I then was dispatched to the mother, who needed deceiving more than persuading to send her child. If Ajax had gone, the fleet would still be stranded at Aulis. Next, I was sent on a dangerous mission to Troy as an envoy. I saw and entered the council chamber on Ilium's heights. When the city was still well crowded with men, I fearlessly argued, the case on behalf of the Greek coalition as I'd been instructed, accusing Paris and firmly demanding Helen's return, with all the possessions she'd taken. Priam was moved to agree, and so was Antenor, but Paris, his brothers and fellow abductors, could hardly restrain their iniquitous hands, as you know full well, Menelaus. That day was the first when I backed you at risk to my own life. There isn't the time to recount the contribution I made to planning and action throughout the length of that tedious war. After the early battles, the Trojans confined themselves inside the walls of their city. A long while passed when there wasn't the chance of an open engagement. We finally fought in the 10th year. What were you doing, Ajax, in all that time? You only knew about fighting and otherwise weren't any use, while I was busily occupied, laying traps for the enemy, ringing our lines with trenches, raising the troops' morale to enable them better to cope with the boredom, making supply arrangements for food and arms, and going on missions as need demanded. Then, lo and behold, deceived by a dream which Jupiter sends him, King Agamemnon commands the chiefs to abort operations, justifying this order by claiming that Jupiter wills it. Would Ajax oppose this change and demand the destruction of Troy? Would he fight, which is all he can do? Why didn't he stop the withdrawal? Why didn't he seize his arms to offer some lead to the wavering rabble? It wasn't too much to expect of a person whose every word is a brag. What actually happened? He joined in the rout. I saw you, Ajax, to my great shame when you ran for your life, and issued those shameful orders to spread the sails of your ship. I instantly shouted, "What are you up to? You must be crazy, my friend, stampeding to give up Troy when it's virtually taken. 10 years have gone by, and all you are taking home is dishonor." With words such as these, and others inspired by my indignation, I made the runaways turn and brought them back from the ships. Agamemnon summoned the troops, still quaking with fear, to a meeting. But even then, the heroic Ajax hadn't the courage to open his mouth. Thersites actually ventured to challenge the kings, and was punished by me for his rudeness. I rose to my feet, and exhorted my frightened countrymen to confront the Trojans, thus restoring the courage they'd lost. And ever since then, whatever valiant deeds my rival may seem to have done can be counted my own, as I dragged him back when he tried to retreat. Finally, who on our side ever praises or seeks you out? Diomedes shares his adventures with me, and I am the man whom he wants for his comrade. He always feels safe when Ulysses is with him. It's no mean thing to be specially picked by him out of all those thousands of Greeks. I wasn't chosen by lot for the venture, but all the same I defied the risks of a night patrol, and disposed of a foe who was out, like us, on a dangerous mission. Dolon the Phrygian. I killed him, but not before I had forced him to talk and betray the plans which the treacherous Trojans were laying. Now in possession of all the information I needed, I could have returned to base and won the acclaim I'd been promised. But not content with so little, I made for Rhesus's encampment, and there I slaughtered the king and his staff in their very own tents. So thus victorious, my hopes accomplished, I captured and mounted the royal chariot. I might have been riding in glorious triumph. My lords, if you now deny me the arms of Achilles, whose horses Dolon demanded as his reward for the work of that night, you'll be meaner than Ajax, who said Diomedes and I should divide them. No point in recalling the havoc I wreaked with my sword in the ranks of Lycian Sarpedon, neither the blood that flowed when I slaughtered Coeranus, Iphitus's son, with Alastor, Alcander, Noemon, Chromius, Halius, Prytanis, cut down Thoon and Charops, Chersidamus, Ennomus, forced to his death by a merciless fate, and others less famous who fell by my hand close up to the walls. I also have wounds to display, my friends. They were nobly won on the front of my body. Don't trust in my empty words. Look here. And he opened his tunic. This heart has always been engaged in your service. But what about Ajax? In all these years he has shed not a single drop of blood for his friends, and his body remains unmarked. What does it really matter if Ajax claims he defended the fleet of the Greeks against the Trojans when Jupiter backed them? I admit that he did so, of course. It's not my way to be spiteful or denigrate what's well done, but he shouldn't reserve for himself what belongs to all. He should give some credit to you, my lords. Patroclus, safely disguised in Achilles' armor, repulsed the Trojans before they could burn the ships with Ajax inside them. My rival reckons that none but he had the courage to duel with Hector, forgetting the king and the chiefs and forgetting myself. In fact, he was ninth to come forward and only selected by lot. But what was the final result of your fight with Hector, you bravest of warriors? Hector went off without one wound on his body. My lords, I find it exceedingly painful to be reminded of that black hour when Achilles, the bulwark of all the Greeks, laid down his life. But my tears, my sorrow, my fear of the enemy never prevented my lifting his body to carry it home. These, I say, were the shoulders on which the corpse of Achilles was borne from the field with the weapons I now am striving to win. I have the physical strength that is needed to bear such a weight, and I have the mind which will surely value this tribute from you. Why was Achilles' Nereid mother so deeply concerned to obtain fresh arms for her son? Did she really intend that present from Vulcan, that work of consummate art, to be worn by a brainless and uncouth soldier? He couldn't describe the features engraved on the shield, the ocean, the earth, and the sky with its constellations, the Pleiades and the Hyades, the bear that never sinks in the sea, the circles of sun and moon, and the gleaming sword of Orion. He is asking you to award him arms which he cannot appreciate. Ajax attacks me for shirking the hardships of war and arriving late on the scene when the expedition was underway. Has he no idea that he's also maligning the valiant Achilles? If you call dissembling a crime, then we both dissembled, Achilles and I. If delay is a fault, then I arrived before he did. I was detained by my wife's devotion, and he by his mother's. We gave our youth to our loved ones, the rest of our lives to Greece. If I couldn't refute the charge, I should still be proud to have shared my guilt with a hero such as Achilles, though he was detected by my intelligence. I was not detected by Ajax. My lords, we mustn't be too surprised that Ajax is flinging his stupid slanders at me. You also are being accused of disgraceful behavior. Or was it a shocking scandal for me to have falsely accused Palamedes, but splendid for you to convict him? In fact, Palamedes could not rebut the indictment of treason or challenge the evidence leveled against him. You didn't just hear it, you saw what he'd done. The case was proved by the bribes he had taken. I don't deserve to be blamed because Philoctetes is stranded on Vulcan's island of Lemnos. Defend your part in the action, my lord, since you approved it. I grant that I offered my view, that he'd better withdraw himself from the war and the arduous journey, and try by resting to ease the terrible pain of his wound. Philoctetes agreed, and survives to this day. My advice was not only well meant, though that would have been enough, it was also effective. Now the seers declare he is needed for Troy's destruction. Don't send me to escort him. He's crazed by his pain and resentment. Far better for Ajax to go and use his powers of persuasion to soften his fury and bring him to Troy by some crafty stratagem. Seriously, though, the Simois River will flow upstream, Mount Ida stand leafless, and Greece will promise her aid to Troy, before I tire in my thoughtful efforts on your behalf, and you have to call on the cunning wits of the witless Ajax. No matter how much self-willed Philoctetes may hate his old allies, detest Agamemnon, abominate me, and endlessly rain down curses upon my head, or pray that fortune will place me within his pain-stricken reach and allow him to drain my blood, I shall go for him all the same and endeavor to bring him to Troy. With luck I shall seize his arrows, as surely as I took Helenus prisoner, the prophet through whom I revealed the oracle's word, how Troy could be captured, then ventured into the heart of the foe to seize the statue of Pallas, which stood in her innermost shrine. In the light of this, can Ajax compare himself to Ulysses? The fates indeed had declared that Troy could never be captured without that image. But where, my lords, was the valiant Ajax? Where were the strong man's boasts? And why should he then be frightened? Why did Ulysses dare to make his way through the watch, entrust himself to the night, and brave the swords of the foe, not merely to enter the walls of the Trojans, but mount right up to the top of the citadel, thence to steal the goddess away from her sacred temple and carry her back through the enemy lines? Without this achievement of mine, Telamonian Ajax's arm would have wielded the sevenfold layers of his ox-hide shield to no purpose. That night, by my doing, the victory was won and Troy was defeated. Pergamum fell at the instant I made it no longer invincible. Ajax, stop pointing out with your mutters and sullen looks that I always could use Diomedes. Far be it from me to deny it. You weren't alone when you bore your shield in defense of the allied fleet. A crowd was behind you, while only one person accompanied me. If he wasn't aware that fighters come lower than thinkers, and prizes aren't owed to a strong right arm, however unflinching, he'd claim those weapons himself, and so would Ajax the Lesser, warlike Eurypylus, Thoas the son of the famous Andremon. So would Idomeneus, Meriones, his companion from Crete, and royal Agamemnon's younger brother, the brave Menelaus. Of course, they are sturdy warriors, fully my equals in battle, but not in the tactics of warfare. Your physical might serves well on the field, but your limited powers of thinking need my direction. Your strength is mindless, where my concern is to plan ahead. You surely can fight, but it's I who advises the king when he's choosing the critical moment for action. Your simple brawn must be measured against my brains. In a ship, the helmsman takes precedence over the rower. In the war, the commander has more respect than the soldier, so I must rank above you. In the makeup of human beings, intelligence counts for more than our hands, and that is our true strength. Princes of Greece, I call on you now to reward your watchmen. Reward me for all those years of anxious and careful devotion. I ask you to give me the prize which I'm owed for my dutiful service. My work is complete. By removing the obstacle fate had imposed, by enabling the capture of Ilium's towers, I achieved their capture. By all the hopes that we share, by the toppling defenses of Troy, in the name of the gods whose aid I recently stole from the foe, by anything yet to be done where intelligent action is needed, remember Ulysses, or else, if it cannot be mine, let this armor be hers. And he pointed towards the fateful image of Pallas. The chieftains were swayed by Ulysses, and oratory's power was proved, when the valiant warrior's arms were won by the skillful speaker. The loser, who'd fought with Hector in single combat, who'd often withstood the assaults of fire and sword and of Jupiter, only failed to withstand his own anger. The hero whom no one had beaten was beaten at last by resentment. Grasping his sword, he cried, "This at least is mine. Or is this also claimed by Ulysses? It must be wielded against myself. The weapon so often stained with the blood of the Trojans must now be stained with its masters. No one shall have the power to conquer Ajax but Ajax." He spoke, and into the breast which had never been wounded before, he drove his murderous sword till he buried it up to the hilt. His hands were too weak to draw out the deeply embedded weapon. It was only expelled by the force of his blood, which reddened the earth, and there gave rise to a purple flower from the soft green turf. A flower which had once been born from the wound of the young hyacinthus. Both boy and man were recalled in the letters inscribed on the petals. Ai, Ai, for a cry of lament, Ai, Ai, for the name of a hero. The victor Ulysses then sailed on a quest to the island of Lemnos, a land that once had been ruled by Hypsipyle, daughter of Thoas, notorious too as a place where the women had murdered their husbands. He went to procure the arrows which Hercules gave Philoctetes. After these had been brought, with their master, back to the Greeks, an unduly protracted struggle at long last reached a conclusion. Ilium blazed, and before the flames had fully subsided, Jupiter's altar was stained by the murder of aged, thin-blooded Priam. Cassandra, Apollo's priestess, was dragged away by the hair, extending her arms to the sky in a useless appeal. The Dardanian women clung to the statues of Troy's old gods for as long as they could, but were ruthlessly torn from the burning shrines by the conquering Greeks, a prize which excited the wrath divine. Astyanax, Hector's son, was cast from the towers, from where his eyes so often had followed his mother's finger and watched his father fighting to guard both him and their forefathers' kingdom. Soon a wind from the north was inviting the Greeks to depart. The sails flapped loud in the breeze, and the sailors shouted, "Away!" "Farewell, dear city," the women of Troy cried out as they knelt to kiss the soil of their land and abandon the smoking ruins. The last of the women to go on board, and a pitiful sight, was Hecuba. Soldiers had found her wandering round the graves of her sons, as she clung to the mounds and was kissing the bones. She was forcibly dragged away by Ulysses. Still, she had managed to rescue the ashes of Hector and bear them off in the folds of her garments. On Hector's tomb she had left a lock of her silvery hair. That lock and her tears were the only funeral gifts she could offer. Across the water from Phrygia, the region where Troy once stood, you will find the land of the Thracians, and there was the splendid palace of rich Polymestor, to whom King Priam had secretly sent his youngest son Polydorus. His father had wanted the lad to be brought up safely and kept away from the Trojan War. A sensible plan, if a hoard of wealth hadn't gone with the boy, to provoke his guardian's greed and prove a temptation to murder. When Ilium's fortunes fell, the treacherous king of the Thracians picked up his sword and plunged it into his charge's throat. And then, as though all trace of the crime could be killed with the victim, he tossed Polydorus's corpse from a cliff to be lost in the billows. Nearby on the Thracian coast, Agamemnon had anchored his fleet. He needed a sea that was perfectly calm and a friendlier wind. Here, all of a sudden, a crack appeared in the earth, and Achilles emerged, in presence as tall and strong as he'd been in his lifetime. The dangerous gleam in his threatening eyes recalled the day when he'd drawn his sword on King Agamemnon in murderous anger. "Greeks," he exclaimed, "can you sail away without remembering me? Have your thanks for my valor been buried along with my ashes? Do not commit such a sin. My grave must not go unhonored. Appease the ghost of Achilles by sacrificing Polyxena." So he spoke, and his comrades obeyed the pitiless phantom. Torn from Hecuba's arms, she was almost the only comfort her mother had left. The ill-starred maiden displayed a courage transcending a woman's, as guards led her up to the hero's mound, to be laid on his grave as a victim. Once in front of the fatal altar, she realized the cruel rite was intended for her, but she never forgot who she was. When she saw Neoptolemus waiting, sword in hand, with his eyes intently fixed on her own, she said to him, "Take my noble blood and delay no longer. I am prepared. All you need do is bury your sword in my throat or my breast." And she bared her throat and her bosom together. "Polyxena surely would never consent to be any man's slave. I only wish that the news of my death could be kept from my mother. The thought of her sorrow detracts from the joy that my sacrifice brings me. Although it's her own life, hardly my death, which should cause her to tremble." Next she turned to her guards and said, "May I ask one thing? Please leave me, I beg you, and stand far off. My wish is to pass to the Stygian ghosts as free as I've lived. Do not sully a maiden's body with your male hands. The spirit, whoever he is, whose anger you seek to appease, will be satisfied better by blood that flows from a willing victim. Yet one boon more, if my final words have the power to move. It is Priam's daughter, no captive, who asks you. Restore my remains to my mother without demanding a ransom. Allow her to pay with her tears, not in gold, for the dismal right to bury my body. She paid gold too when she could." As she finished speaking, the people could not restrain the tears which she had avoided. Even the priest, Neoptolemus, wept, and plunged his sword through her offered breast with a heavy heart. Polyxena's knees gave way and she sank to the ground, still keeping the fearless look on her face till the final moment of death. And even then, as she fell, she preserved her maidenly virtue, arranging her garments to cover the parts men's eyes should not see. The women of Troy then lifted her body. They counted the children Priam had lost and reckoned the blood that had flowed from a single house. They lamented the maiden, lamented the queen, so recently known as the consort and mother of kings, the mirror of Asia's glory, and now no more than a meager share of the loot, whom the victor Ulysses would scorn if she weren't after all the mother of Hector. Yes, Hector secured his captive mother a master. Embracing the brave Polyxena's lifeless body, Hecuba shed for her daughter the tears she so often had shed for her country, her sons, and her husband. She washed her dear child's wounds with those tears. She covered her lips with kisses and rained fresh blows on her own poor breasts. Then, sweeping her white hair over the clotted blood and tearing her bosom, she cried in the course of a long lamentation. My daughter, the last of your mother's sorrows, what else can befall me? My child, you are dead, and I see your wound, my wound no less. Yes, you too have a wound. I wasn't allowed to lose one child without blood being spilt. I thought, since you were a girl, you'd be safe from the sword, but girl though you were, the sword has destroyed you. The selfsame butcher who murdered your brothers has murdered you, Achilles, who ruined Troy and has left me bereft of my children. And yet, when he fell to the arrows of Paris and Phoebus Apollo, I reckoned, at least Achilles is not to be feared any more. But I needed to fear him still, for even his buried ashes are angry with our great house. His spite can be felt from the tomb. I carried all those children for him. Great Ilium's flattened. The people's affliction has come to an end in the fall of their city, but still it has ended. It's only for me that Pergamum's standing. My tale of sorrow goes on. I was once the most powerful woman in all the world. I was strong in my husband, my sons, and my daughters. Now, I've been torn from my loved ones' graves and am helplessly dragged into exile to serve as Penelope's prize. As I spin my daily portion of wool, she'll point me out to the Ithacan women, and proudly say to them, there is the famous mother of Hector, there is the wife of King Priam. Then after so many losses, you, my daughter, the only companion surviving to comfort a mother's griefs, have been slaughtered to soothe an enemy's ghost. I bore my enemy's funeral gift. Oh, why should my heart of iron endure any longer? Why wait for death to arrive? What good can come in these weary years? Why keep an old woman alive, you unfeeling gods, if I'm only to see more corpses? Who would have thought that Priam could ever be talked of as happy after the fall of Troy? He is happy because of his own death. He cannot see your lifeless remains before his eyes, my beloved daughter. He lost his life when he lost his kingdom. Well, no doubt, as a royal princess, you'll be dowered with funeral rites, and your body will find a home in the family vault. Alas, that isn't the luck of our house. The only offerings you will receive are your mother's tears and a handful of alien dust. Yes, all is lost, but there is one reason to cling to life for a short while longer. One specially favorite child, the only son who remains to me now, and once was my youngest, the boy whom we sent to the Thracian king on these shores, Polydorus. But why, meanwhile, am I still delaying to wash my Polyxena's cruel wounds and the face so ruthlessly spattered with blood? So saying, the luckless Hecuba hobbled down to the shore, tearing her hoary locks, as she called to her Trojan women to hand her a pitcher for drawing water out of the waves. She saw, cast up on the beach, the corpse of her son Polydorus, mangled with gaping wounds from the sword of the Thracian king. Her attendants screamed, but the queen was totally dumb in her anguish. Her voice was stifled. The tears which were welling behind her eyes never came. She stood there, frozen in grief, as rigid as granite. She stared at the ground directly before her, or else, with a grim look, lifted her eyes to the sky, then gazed on her son as he lay there, gazed on his face and gazed on his wounds above all, while she armed herself with smoldering fury and marshaled her wrath. As her anger burst into flames, she resolved to punish the killer, Queen Hecuba still, and her mind was filled with her picture of vengeance. As a lioness out on the warpath, newly deprived of her suckling cub, discovers and follows the trail of her unseen foe, so Hecuba, after her grief was mingled with anger, forgetting her age but not forgetting her rage, made straight for the vile Polymestor, the man who had foully contrived to murder her boy. She requested a meeting, and told the king that she wanted to show him a hoard of gold that she'd hidden, to be returned to her son. The Thracian tyrant believed her, and scenting the whiff of yet further booty, he came to the lonely spot. Then, craftily smiling, he said to the queen, "Come on now, Hecuba, give me the gold for your son. I swear by the gods in heaven that all you give now, and gave in the past, shall be his." As he perjured himself by these lies, she ferociously watched, till her temper mounted and boiled right over. And then she grabbed hold of him tight, with a shout to her posse of female captives, and dug her fingers into his treacherous eyes, to gouge the balls from their sockets. The power was lent by her anger. Next, she defiled her hands in his guilty blood by plunging them into his face and clawing, not at his eyes, they were gone, but the holes where his eyes had been. The people of Thrace were enraged by this savage assault on their king, and started to pelt the Trojan woman with weapons and stones, but she just snapped with a snarling growl at the rocks which they threw. As she opened her jaws in a vain attempt to give tongue, she barked. The place where this miracle happened exists to this day, and is suitably called Cynosema, the dog's tomb. Even after this change, old Hecuba long remembered her ancient wrongs, and the plains of Thrace were filled with her doleful howling. Her Trojan friends and her Grecian foes were distressed alike by the fate of the queen, and all of the gods were affected, every one of them. Even Jupiter's sister and consort declared that Hecuba hadn't deserved such an ending as that. Only Aurora felt no pain at Troy's and Hecuba's ruinous fall, although she had backed their cause in the war. She hadn't the time. She was touched by a closer personal grief in the loss of Memnon, the son whom the goddess with robes of saffron had watched being killed on the Phrygian plains by the spear of Achilles. That moment, the rosy red which tinges the sky in the morning turned to a deadly pallor, and heaven was hidden in a cloud. When Memnon's body was laid on the funeral pyre, his mother was too heartbroken to watch. With her hair still loosened in token of mourning, she humbly prostrated herself at the knees of Almighty Jove and addressed him in tears. "I know that I am the lowest of all the gods in the golden heavens. My temples are few and widely scattered across the world. But I still am a goddess. I've not come here to obtain more shrines or festival days, or altars to blaze with sacrificed victims. If you would consider what useful service I render, although I am only a woman. Each dawn, when I check the night from encroaching on day's domain, you'd judge I should have some reward. But I'm not concerned in my present state of distress to claim the worship I'm justly owed. I am here because I have lost my Memnon, who doughtily fought, though in vain, for his uncle Priam, and then was condemned by you gods to be killed in the prime of his life at the hands of the doughty Achilles. Supreme ruler of heaven, I pray you to comfort his spirit by paying some tribute, and so to soothe the wounds of his mother." Jupiter nodded assent. Young Memnon's high-built pyre collapsed. The flames leapt up, and rolling columns of black smoke darkened the light of day, as vapor rises like breath from the rivers and forms a fog which the sun's bright rays cannot penetrate. Cinders of charcoal flew to the sky, then massed and thickened into a single body, assuming an outline and drawing heat and life from the fire. The ash's lightness provided its wings. Could it be a winged creature? At first no more than a phantom, but soon a rustle of feathers. A bird! Then a flock of her sisters was beating their wings beside her, and all derived from the same source. They circled the pyre 3 times. 3 times their unison wailing rang through the air. The 4th time round they divided their forces. 2 armies, marshaled on different sides, engaged in a savage battle, angrily using their beaks and the hooks of their talons to tear the breasts and to tire the wings of the enemy facing them. Bodies created from dead man's ash fell down from the air, to be funeral gifts in remembrance of Memnon, the hero from whom they were sprung, and who also gave these miraculous fledglings their name of Maimonides. Each year, when the sun has completed its zodiac round, they go to war once again and die like their parents. And so, while others lamented the change of Hecuba into a barking dog, Aurora was wholly absorbed in her own grief. She weeps to this day, and the morning dew is her dutiful mourning. Yet destiny wouldn't allow Troy's hopes to be overturned along with her walls. Aeneas, the hero whose mother was Venus, rescued his household gods, and through the flames on his shoulders he carried a burden as sacred, his venerable father Anchises. These, with his own dear son Ascanius, formed the spoil which Aeneas the dutiful chose to salvage from all his possessions. Fleeing across the sea with his people in ships from Antandros, he came to the infamous coast of Thrace, where the young Polydorus had stained the earth with his blood. But he quickly abandoned the visit. Next, with the backing of wind and tide, he arrived at Apollo's island of Delos, and entered the city with all his companions. Aeneas, king of the people, who also served as the priest of Apollo, welcomed Aeneas into the palace and temple. He showed him the town with its famous shrines and the stumps of the 2 trees, gripped long ago by Leto's arms in the pangs of her labor. Incense was cast in the flames, and wine was poured on the incense. Entrails of sacrificed oxen were burnt in traditional manner. That done, all made for the palace hall, where they rested on high-raised couches and freely partook of the gifts of Ceres and Bacchus. Then said pious Anchises, "Chosen priest of Apollo, I could be mistaken, but when I entered these walls for the first time, I seem to remember your family boasting a son and 4 daughters." Aeneas shook his head, encircled in snow-white bands, and sadly replied, "You are perfectly right, most mighty Anchises. You saw a man who was blessed with 5 magnificent offspring. But now, so fickle in human fortune, I'm almost bereft of my children. What help can my son afford when he lives as my regent, far away on the island of Andros, which bears his name? Apollo gave him prophetic powers, while Bacchus endowed my daughters with other talents surpassing hope or belief. All that they touched was transformed into corn or wine or the juice of the gray-green olive, which made them a source of exceptional profit. This came to the ears on his voyage to Troy of King Agamemnon. We also were hit to a certain degree by the storm advancing on you, and he used armed force to tear my daughters away from their loving father against their will. Then he told them to use their miraculous powers to supply the Argive fleet with provisions. They all escaped where they could. 2 found a home in Euboea. The other pair got away to their brother's island of Andros. An army arrived with an ultimatum demanding the women's surrender. Fear prevailed over brotherly love, and Andros handed his sisters over to pay the price for their flight. Forgivable weakness, perhaps. No Aeneas was there to defend him. No Hector, whose courage enabled you all to survive 10 years. The prisoners' arms were awaiting their shackles, but while they were still free, both of them raised their hands to the sky and called upon Bacchus to come to their aid, which he did, if strangely losing one's shape is aid of a sort, though how they lost it I never have known and couldn't say now. But the final disaster was all too plain. My daughters were covered with feathers and changed into snow-white doves, the birds that are sacred to Venus, your own dear consort, Anchises. The banquet passed in the telling of these and similar stories. The tables were taken away, and all retired to their beds. Rising at dawn, the Trojan wanderers visited Phoebus's oracular shrine. The god enjoined them to search for their ancient mother in kindred shores. As they left, the king escorted them down to the ships and gave them presents to speed their departure. Anchises received a staff, his grandson a cloak and a quiver, Aeneas a mixing bowl, which his host had been brought as a gift in the past by one of his guest friends, Therses of Thebes in Boeotia. The bowl had been crafted by Alcon of Rhodes and told a long story, embossed on the metal. It showed a city with 7 gates, you could easily point them out, which stood for the name of the city, and said what it was. Outside, a funeral scene was depicted, with burial mounds and funeral pyres. There were women with naked breasts and wildly disheveled hair in token of mourning. Nymphs could also be seen in tears, bemoaning their dried-up springs. The leafless trees were standing all stiff and bare, while goats were nibbling at rocks and grazing on withered lichen. There, in the middle of Thebes, the artist had pictured Orion's daughters who died for their people. Their bodies were being carried along the streets to the square in a lovely cortege for cremation. And then, to continue the family line, from out of the maiden's ashes, there rose 2 youths, whom legend knows as Coronai, and these were portrayed as leading a second solemn procession to carry the ashes from which they had sprung from pyre to tomb. So much for the gleaming figures embossed on the ancient bronze work. The rim of the bowl was adorned in relief with gilded acanthus. The Trojans reciprocated these presents with others as handsome. The priest of Apollo was given a casket for storing his incense, a splendid libation bowl, and a gold crown studded with jewels. From Delos they sailed to Crete, the homeland of Teucer, to whom the Trojans remembered they owed their descent. But they couldn't endure the climate for long, so they left the Isle of 100 Cities, and eagerly set their course for their promised Italian land. But a storm blew up which battered their ships and drove them into the Strophades' port. This proved a treacherous shelter, as hope was turned to dismay by Aello the Harpy's frightening prophecies. Soon they had passed Dulichium's harbor, Ithaca, Samos, and Neritos' town, which was part of the kingdom of crafty Ulysses. Then they sighted Ambracia, the city 3 gods had competed to have for their own, with the rock in the shape of the shepherd judge who had been transformed. Ambracia is now well known for Apollo's temple at Actium, crowning the cape. They called at Dodona, grove of the talking oaks, and entered Chaonia's bay, where good King Munychus' sons escaped from the flames when impious robbers set fire to their house by being changed into birds. Next they made for Corcyra, an island of fruitful orchards, but came to port in Epirus, where Helenus reigned in Buthrotum, the city he called New Troy. When the prophet had faithfully warned them of all the dangers ahead, they put to sea once again and landed on Sicily's soil. This island can boast 3 capes, Pacanus facing the south with its rainy winds, Lilybaeum, the gentler breezes that flow from the west, and Pelorus, the bears and the freezing blasts of the north. The Trojans arrived at Pelorus. Rowing ashore on a favoring tide as the night came on, they discovered a sandy cove for their ships on the coast of Messana. The straits on the left are unsafe because of the restless Charybdis, who catches the passing ships to gulp them down in her whirlpool, and then to vomit them forth. The right is infested by Scylla, a monster whose foul black belly is girdled with ravening dogs. Her face is a girl's, and assuming the stories that poets have left us are not completely untrue, she had been a girl who was courted by numerous wooers, though Scylla rejected them all and often went down to the ocean nymphs, who were always delighted to see her, to gossip about the various lovers whose suit she'd evaded. One day she was combing the hair of one of the nymphs, Galatea, who heaved a series of sighs and then protested with feeling. "Oh, Scylla, a civilized class of wooer is trying to win your hand, and you aren't at risk in refusing them all as you're doing. But I, whose father is Nereus, whose mother is sea-green Doris, I, who am also blessed with a throng of sisters to guard me, have only escaped from the Cyclops' love at a grievous price." Her voice, as she spoke, was choked with tears. When Scylla had wiped Galatea's eyes with her smooth white fingers and given her comfort, she said to the goddess, "My dearest friend, please tell me your trouble. Why are you sad? Don't keep it a secret. You know you can trust me." The Nereid thus responded to Scylla's compassionate questions. Faunus, a god of the countryside, had a son called Acis. The child had been born to a nymph who was sprung from the river Symaethus, and gave the greatest of joy to both his father and mother, but joy even greater to me, as he was my only lover, a beautiful boy of 16, with the first smooth down on his cheeks. While I kept sighing for him, I was chased night and day by the Cyclops. If you asked me whether I hated the Cyclops more than I worshipped Acis, I couldn't give you an answer. My love and my loathing were equally balanced. O Venus, our mother, with what strong power you govern our hearts. The Cyclops was such a barbaric creature. Even the woods were appalled by his presence. No stranger could safely encounter the giant who scorned the gods and the heights of Olympus. And yet he discovered the meaning of love, and neglected his flocks and his cave when the flames of his violent passion were raging inside him. Now, in his longing to please me, he bothered about his appearance. The wild Polyphemus was combing his prickly locks with a mattock, attempting to trim his shaggy beard with a pruning hook, and trying to look less fierce when he gazed at his face in a pool. His passion for slaughter, his brutal ways, and his boundless bloodlust were all in abeyance. The ships could arrive and depart without danger. One day, a visitor put into Sicily, close to Mount Etna, Telemus, Eurymus' son, an infallible augur of omens. He came to the grim Polyphemus and said, "You are doomed to be robbed of that single eye on the front of your brow by a man called Ulysses." The Cyclops replied with a laugh, "You are wrong, most stupid of prophets. My eye has already been robbed by another." And so he rejected that truthful but useless warning, and pompously trampled the shore with his giant steps, or withdrew tired out to the depths of his cave. Picture a wedge-like promontory jutting over the sea in a long sharp point, while the waves swirl round each side at the bottom. Here the fierce Polyphemus climbed and eased himself down where the view was the best, with his leaderless sheep all trailing behind him. He dropped the pine trunk, tall as a mast, which served for his staff, by his feet, and produced an enormous pipe of 100 reeds. His shepherd's whistling was heard by the waves and across the whole range of surrounding mountains. I also drank it in from a distance, hiding close to the cliff and reclined in the arms of my Acis. These are the words which I heard him sing and fixed in my memory. "Whiter than snowy petals of privet, my fair Galatea, richer in bloom than the meadows, more slender and tall than the alder, sparkling as crystal glass, more sprightly and free than a young kid, smoother than all the shells that are worn away by the ocean, welcome as sun in the winter or shade in the heat of the summer. You nimble gazelle, you lovelier sight than the tallest of plane trees, gleaming more brightly than ice and sweeter than grapes in the harvest, softer than curdled milk or the feathery wings of a swan, more lush than a beautiful garden, if only you wouldn't avoid me. Wilder too than an untamed heifer, my fair Galatea, harder than ancient oak, more wayward than shifting waves, tougher than shoots of the pliant willow or bryony bine. More stubborn than this stone crag, more rough than a river in full spate, proud as a peacock in grand display, more fiery than fire, more prickly than thorns, more fierce than the she-bear nursing her young, more deaf than the sea, more vicious and cruel than a trampled snake, with the power that I wish above all I could take away from your nature, the fleetness of foot to outpace not only the stag when he's chased by the baying pack, but even the winds and the wing-swift breezes. Oh, if you only knew, you'd regret having shunned me. You'd even curse your own coyness and do your utmost to hold my affections. I own a cave on the mountainside. It is vaulted over in living rock, and it never lets in the heat of the midday sun or the winter's cold. My orchards are groaning with apples. My trailing vines are swollen with grapes, both golden yellow and purply red. I am storing each harvest for your delight. With your own fair hands you will pick the most delicious of strawberries growing under the trees, the cornel berries in autumn, and juicy plums, not only the dark blue kind, but also the choicer sort with the golden color of fresh-made wax. With me as your lover, you'll have sweet chestnuts and arbutus fruits in the richest abundance, so every tree shall be at your service. All these sheep are my own, many others are roaming the valleys, browsing apart in the woods or safely penned in my cave. If you asked me, I shouldn't be able to tell you how many there are. Only a poor man counts his sheep, but you needn't believe what I say in their praise. If you come to the fold, you will see for yourself that their legs can hardly straddle the udders, they're so distended. You'll see my lambs in their snug warm pens and my baby goats. I always have pailfuls of rich white milk, and I keep one part to be drunk as it is, while the rest is hardened by rennet to cheeses. The pets that I lay in your lap won't only be ordinary presents, the easy ones to obtain, like a doe or a hare or a goat, a pair of doves or a nest of birds removed from a treetop. I've found a couple of twins whom you'll be able to play with. So like each other you'll hardly be able to tell them apart. Some cubs that I took on the mountain peak from a shaggy bear. When I found them, I said to myself, I'll keep those cubs for my mistress. Now, Galatea, do raise your glistening head from the deep blue sea and come to my arms. Don't scorn the gifts that I offer. Truly, I know myself. I recently saw my reflection in pure, clear water and liked the image that met my gaze. Look at my massive size. Great Jupiter high in the heavens hasn't a larger frame. In the tale you people keep telling, some Jove or other is reigning up there. A forest of hair towers over my strong, stern features and shades my magnificent shoulders. Don't think me ugly because my body's a bristling thicket of prickly hair. A tree is ugly without any foliage. So is a horse if a mane doesn't cover his tawny neck. Birds are bedecked in plumage, and sheep are clothed in their own wool. Men look well with a beard and a carpet of hair on their chests. I've only one eye on my brow in the middle, but that is as big as a fair-sized shield. Does it matter? The sun looks down from the sky on the whole wide world, and he watches it all with a single eye. Remember, my father is king of your own abode of the sea. I'm giving you him for a father-in-law. Have pity, I beg you, and hear your suppliants please. You're the only being I bow to. I scorn proud Jove and his sky, and the piercing bolt of his lightning. It's you that I fear, Galatea. Your anger is fiercer than lightning. To tell you the truth, I could better endure this cruel contempt if all your suitors were shunned. But why reject Polyphemus and turn to Acis for love? What are Acis's embraces to mine? Very well, let him fancy himself, and you have my reluctant permission to fancy him too, Galatea. But let chance bring him my way, and he'll soon discover the giant strength in my giant's frame. I'll draw his guts from his living body, then tear it to pieces, and scatter his limbs all over the fields and the waves where your home is. Yes, he can mate with you there like that. Oh, see, I am burning. The fire of the terrible wrong you have done me is blazing more fiercely. Mount Etna has moved. I can feel it erupting inside my heart with all its volcanic power, and it leaves you cold, Galatea. The Cyclops finished his futile lament. I was watching and saw him rise and keep on the move as he stumped away through the well-known pastures and woods like a frantic bull deprived of his cow. Acis and I were entirely unready for what happened next. The wild brute suddenly saw us and cried aloud, "I can see you, and I'll make certain that this is the last of your loving encounters." The tone of his voice was as loud as you might expect in a furious Cyclops. His shouting created a quake in the whole of Mount Etna. My own response was to dive straight into the sea in a panic, while Acis, my hero, turned and took to his heels as he yelled out, "Help me, help Galatea, I beg you. Oh, help me, my parents. I'm going to die. You must let me into your watery kingdom." The Cyclops followed him close, then wrenched a part of the mountain away from its side and hurled it at Acis. Although his rival was only struck by the edge of the rock, it crushed him completely. I then did the only thing which the fates would allow. I gave my lover the powers of his mother's father, the river Samaethus. A trickle of crimson blood was flowing from under the boulder, but after a little while the redness started to vanish. First it turned the muddy brown of a swollen torrent, then slowly it cleared completely. That moment I touched the rock and it gaped wide open. A tall green seed shot up from the crack. The hollow mouth of the opening rang with the roar of cascading water, and wonder of wonders, there suddenly rose waist-high a youth with horns on his brow, which were wreathed in a garland of rushes. The youth was Acis, except he was taller, and all of his face was the color of dark sea green. But even so it was Acis, transformed to a river whose course has retained his original name. Galatea's story was ended, and all her Nereid sisters around her dispersed as they swam to their homes through the peaceful waves. But Scylla returned to the shore, for she dared not trust herself to the open sea, and she either roamed unclothed on the thirsty sand, or when she was tired, she would look for a landlocked cove and take a refreshing bathe in the swirl of a seawater pool. Suddenly, skimming the waves, there arrived a new sea-dweller, Glaucus, who'd recently suffered a change of shape in Boeotian Anthedon. As soon as he sighted the fair young girl, he was snared by her beauty, and said whatever he hoped might prevent her running away. But his words went for nothing. She fled as fast as she could in her terror, and climbed right up to the top of the mountain adjoining the shore. Now picture a huge crag, facing the strait. It peaks in a single point and slopes, well covered with trees, far into the sea. Here Scylla was safe, and she came to a halt. Unsure whether Glaucus was monster or god, she glazed in awe at his blue-green body. The hair which covered his shoulders and back, and the flexible fishtail mounting as far as his loins. The sea god realized that Scylla was struck with amazement, and, leaning up on a nearby rock, "Fair maiden," he said, "I am not some monster or dangerous beast, but a god of the sea. My sway in the ocean is no less mighty than Proteus or Triton wields, or Athamas's offspring, Palaemon. I once was mortal, but even then I was destined for life in the depths of the sea and passed my days in the joys of the ocean, drawing the nets which were drawing the fish, or busily plying my rod as I sat on the rocks. Right next to the shore lies a meadow. One side of the beach you have waves, and the other is bordered by grass. This grass has never been cropped by the sharp-horned heifers or browsed by peaceful sheep or the hairy goats. The pollen's not gathered by busy bees, and the flowers aren't plucked for festival garlands. The field has never been mown with a sickle, and I was the first to sit on the ground there, drying my meshes and spreading the fish on the grass, to count the catch brought into my nets by chance, or lured by the bait to the hook on my line. You may not believe what I'm going to tell you now, but why should I want to deceive you? As soon as the fish were placed on the grass, they started to move, to flop right over and travel across the ground as they'd used to glide into the sea, in the sea. And while I was waiting in wonder, they all jumped into the waves to abandon the shore and the master who'd caught them. I was dumbfounded and long perplexed as I searched for a cause. Had a god produced this effect, or was it some juice in the grass? No grass in the world has a power like this, I said to myself, as I casually plucked a couple of blades and started to chew them. I'd barely swallowed the unfamiliar juices down when I suddenly felt a powerful flutter inside my heart, and was seized with an overwhelming desire to belong to the sea. I couldn't remain where I was, and I cried out, "Earth, I shall never tread you again, farewell." Then I instantly dived underwater. The sea gods received me and judged me worthy of joining their number. Ocean and Tethys were asked to purge me of all my mortal features, and quickly they both took charge of my ritual cleansing. After they'd chanted a spell 9 times for my purification, I next was told to immerse myself in 100 streams. At once the rivers discharged their waters from every direction, and swirled in a deluge over my head. So much I remember, and thus can tell you what ought to be told. Of the rest I know nothing. As soon as my senses returned, my body was totally different from what it had been before, and I wasn't the same in my mind. It was then that I first set eyes on this beard encrusted with green, on the hair which sweeps in my wake as I swim far over the sea, my colossal shoulders, my blue-colored arms, and my curving legs, which vanish away to a fish with fins. But what is this form worth? What is the point of the sea god's approval of being a god if it all means nothing to you? The god was still speaking, and would have said more, but Scylla had fled. Enraged by this cruel rejection, he made for the halls of the sun god's daughter, the sorceress Circe.